Welcome to the Mindful Healers podcast with
Dr. Jessie Mahoney
and Dr. Ni-Cheng Liang.
We are here to help you learn to pause and be present, awaken your breath, and harness the ripple effects of mindfulness for radiant health.
We get you. We know you. We are you.
We have both been successful on the surface, yet struggling underneath. We have both had cluttered brains, been overwhelmed, and exhausted.
We're healers who have found solutions and want to share them with you.
Join us here to discover a better way.
Welcome to today's episode on making the most of mother-in-law relationships. A reminder that our podcast is not medical advice. Our intention for today is to normalize the fact that we all have unique, sometimes difficult and complicated relationships with other human beings. And we hope to share about some tips with regards to what helps to bring greater ease to these difficult and unique relationships.
We hope you will discover the richness of complicated relationships, the good and the bad, and that there are many different facets of mother-in-law relationships. We will also shed light on being a mother-in-law and having one, and reflections from all sides.
Takeaways include noticing when the tension arises in these unique relationships, letting go of expectations and setting boundaries as helpful approaches in easing these unique relationships. And so I wanted to start off with just naming the fact that mother-in-laws can sometimes cause strife in many families, and it's been normalized to the point where entertainment and media has portrayed these relationships very commonly, poking fun of and really magnifying and dramatizing for entertainment value this oftentimes difficult dynamic.
I think this has happened to the point that we even hear the word mother-in-law and we have a reaction. And so I invite you, in the spirit of our recent podcast on words and words being powerful and impactful, to think about how you feel when the word mother-in-law comes up. And some of us don't smile. Often people talk about, angst and stress and that pit in their stomach, or noticing their bodily reaction to it. We often think that mother-in-laws mean something negative, and mother-in-laws tend to have a very bad reaction and a bad reputation, as we might say. And as many of you know, I'm about to become a mother-in-law, and in many ways sort of am a mother-in-law already by virtue of the fact that my son is engaged, getting married, and having a baby. And so one of my missions is to change our vision of mother-in-law and change the way that we feel when those words are said. And I want to start this off by giving gratitude to my own mother-in-law, who gave me the idea of this. And when I was engaged to my husband 30 years ago, she told me she plans to be a great mother-in-law. And is in essence setting an intention to do so. And so she inspired me to set a similar intention. And my version of a great mother-in-law won't be exactly what she was, but knowing that that was her intention dramatically shifted our relationship. And I'll explain a little bit more about why. And I also want to give credit to her mother-in-law, who was apparently a great mother-in-law. And my mother-in-law always said that. And so she said, we called her Grandma Barbara. And the beautiful thing about this story actually is that Grandma Barbara and I are born on the exact same day, 50 years apart. And she's no longer with us. And my mother-in-law is actually also no longer with us. But they were both amazing, strong, feisty women who decided to be great mother-in-laws. And their daughter-in-laws were much appreciative. And so I think that we can set intentions around these relationships that maybe have the potential for angst. And in doing so, change how they are. And I will say that my mother-in-law, literally by setting this intention and sharing it with me, changed our relationship in that moment before she had done anything else as a mother-in-law. And she wasn't my mother-in-law yet when she said it. And so I have also set the same intention. And I have also told my daughter-in-law that. And so one piece that I want to throw in here about these challenging, difficult relationships is the power of setting an intention. We talk about that a lot, and choosing words for yourself as a mother-in-law. And I haven't actually decided on my words, though. It's clearly the time for me to do that as I say this, and probably during this podcast they're going to emerge. And one of the things I wanted to bring up here is this idea that the relationship is complicated because of love, right? So it's and as a future imminent mother-in-law, it's complicated because I love my son and my daughter-in-law loves my son, and in different ways, and we have different life experiences and different hopes, wishes, aspirations. And my daughter-in-law is having a baby in April, and my son, and they have different hopes and aspirations. And so this love for the grandchild is also complicated in there. And when we love, relationships are much more complicated, and emotions and differences of opinion just become much harder to solve. And so I often see, like, parents, we tend to catastrophize. We catastrophize because we love. We've talked in some of our parenting episodes in the past, we worry because we love. And that tends to cloud all of these relationships, mother-in-law, daughter-in-law, and bring strife into it. And some of our tendencies about right and wrong pop up there too. So I wanted to reflect a little bit on why my mother-in-law was good, because and some of the things that she did were actually coaching before its time. And one of the reasons that I was able to have a good relationship with my mother-in-law is because I employed coaching tools before I knew what they were, actually. My mother-in-law passed away before I became a coach. And so as I was thinking about this episode, I used loving amusement with my mother-in-law from the very beginning, even though I didn't have the term for it. She was the perfect person to practice loving amusement with. She was very passionate. She was very opinionated, and she did things her way. And when I practiced loving amusement and remembered that everything she did was coming from a place of love, I was able to be more flexible. And flexibility might be one of my words as a mother-in-law, although I'm not quite sure if it's quite right. The other thing that I used with my mother-in-law a lot was, of course. And of course she did that. Of course she did that. And towards the end of her life, of course was perfect for her. Like, if she would just, of course, do these things because that's how she ruled, the good things and the bad things. This thought that I often bring up, that she did the best she could in the circumstances with the information, skills, and resources that she had, that is really true. And it became even more obvious after she had a stroke in her early 60s. And so in her last 10 years, she really was doing the best she could with the resources and skills and human body that she had remaining, with a little bit of lack of frontal lobe. And so it was really that phrase serves you incredibly well with mother-in-laws, especially, and with anyone aging. They are usually doing the best that they can with the information, skills, background, even upbringing that they have, or cultural background. A lot of these things, conflicts with mother-in-law, comes from different cultural backgrounds or child rearing expectations. And then the other thing that my mother-in-law modeled for me, that I think actually I learned so much from, and is very helpful in this mother-in-law relationship, is she modeled this idea of putting yourself first. She was not a martyr. She was not a self-sacrificer at all. And she's probably one of the people that modeled that most influentially for me, if that's a word, for my whole life. And so I really, truly learned from her. And I, full disclosure, found it off-putting at first. But now that I'm older, I'm like, wow, she really understood how to take care of yourself first and live an authentic life that you really enjoyed. And not everybody's going to like you when you do that. But I'm grateful for her teaching me that. And so I think if I look at those things, these are tools that I will bring to the relationship too, about myself and about a daughter-in-law, right? Of course, my daughter-in-law is going to do things differently. She's going to do the best she can with the information and resources she has. And loving amusement for she and my son and their approach to things is going to serve me really well. So those are some of the tools that I would bring into the relationship. Oh, and one more I forgot, which is focusing on what's in our control. And on both ends of that spectrum, focusing on how I showed up as a daughter-in-law and now how I show up as a mother-in-law. That's it. That's all that's in my control. And so using these tools and setting an intention, super powerful. And so a nudge too for anyone listening who hasn't listened to our episode about mothers from Mother's Day a couple of years ago. It's really a great episode, and all the tools for having a better relationship with your own mom and honoring your relationship with your own mom, which is what the episode is called, are helpful with honoring the relationship with a mother-in-law as well. Because it really is this truly special relationship. And I'm definitely going to be on a mission to change the immediate reaction to the term mother-in-law.
I wish you well on that mission, and I have no doubt that you will be successful. That was a really beautiful tribute to your mother-in-law, and thank you for those lessons that I will actually take and apply to my own relationship with my mother-in-law. I wanted to also point out that the angst about the relationship that you mentioned, that in and of itself, when you notice that angst, is a moment of mindfulness. And when there's a moment of mindfulness, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to respond in a way that feels more in alignment rather than acting out of reactivity, which, as you had mentioned, when the emotions run high and the relationship is complicated because of love and the way that we love in our families being potentially a bit different, can love actually serve as the compass, as the foundation from which the unique relationship can grow, can blossom from, as opposed to having that kind of angsty energy around it? So thank you so much, Jessie, for sharing that.
That brings to mind the my favorite question, which is what would love do? I'm like, that's what should rule the mother-in-law relationship. Like, because love wouldn't let your mother-in-law be really mean to you. And love wouldn't be mean to a mother-in-law. And love would choose positivity to the best of your ability because it's better for everyone. And the other thing I just want to say also is that my mother-in-law relationship was not perfect. And I think it's also when we've moved on past it, we can more easily see the positive things, but I also didn't get it right. And I think one of the things that I do so much better now with all these coaching and mindfulness tools is I can let that go. I didn't do it perfectly. And I am, you said you wish me well and you think I'm going to get it right. I was like, I'm going to get it right 75% of the time, and I'm not going to get it right. And the beautiful thing about it is I'm going to be okay with that.
Thank you for being human.
Oh,
for letting go of perfectionism, especially around mother-in-law relationships right here. And really, this episode was poignantly inspired by some of my very real increased stressors just recently from the holiday break. This was the first holiday that my family, including my mother-in-law, spent without my father-in-law, who we lost in early November of 2022. And so there was this already intense baseline grief that we were all feeling. And then on top of that, the imposition of different opinions and the shoulding coming out, whether it was like explicitly stated to each other or internally applied, there was suffering that I noticed. And as a result of that, there was distress for everyone that was involved. And despite this, despite having lived through this, I still was able to hold on to compassion and gratitude and empathy for the suffering, especially for my mother-in-law, who had just recently lost her husband, but really also of everyone and what they were experiencing. And so the week, actually, it was more like a week and a half that we had together. It ended up resulting in some peaceful understandings, and peace was basically the result of the 10 days together. Whereas it was kind of rocky in the beginning. I'll fully admit. And I wanted to share what helped me and then perhaps us in having peace. And that question of what would peace do comes up to mind, Jesse, that you also like to ask. So, right off the bat, what caused a lot of the distress were the mismatches of expectations. Each family member had the manuals for each other, and we were not reading each other's manuals. We didn't even know about the existence of the manuals.
Can I interrupt for a second? Because I'm thinking we may have some new listeners who have no idea what a manual is. And I'm thinking that as you bring this up, that you have been coached and you're using your coaching skills here and your mindfulness skills here. And that's what allowed you to see all of this, because it's noticing even the manual. And then just a brief little tidbit on the manual is basically your expectations. And so it's your expectations of what a daughter-in-law should do, your expectations of what a mother-in-law should do, and what's right and what's wrong. And so when we have these lengthy, bulky, several volume manuals, relationships tend to be clunky and heavy and not as comfortable. And so the beautiful thing is mindfulness allows you to see it. And then you can decide what in your manual is really relevant for a healthy relationship. And most of the time, what's in our manual for what we want the other person to do is what we should do. So I'm curious if that came up in your manual.
A little bit. If I wasn't too wrapped up in my reaction initially of the angst.
You also mentioned compassion, right?
Yeah.
And so I might say, like, of course you have angst with your mother-in-law. And of course she has angst with you. And of course, after the death of a loved one recently, everyone came in not at their best. So of course, like your holiday, I think we're also like, oh, this is our time together. But of course it was likely, I haven't even heard the details, but fraught, right?
Yes. I mean, even just the baseline circumstances of bringing us together were complicated and a bit sad. So yeah, even just that setup, of course, it wasn't going to be a perfect, happy, merry, jingle belling holiday.
So what worked?
So letting go of the expectations and also upholding fierce boundaries. There was a lot of letting go, and I'll delve more into all of that. But I want to back up and talk a bit more about the mindfulness piece, because noticing was so important. And the 10 days together really tested my mindfulness practice, and also it allowed me to ground into my mindfulness practice in the moment, and also setting aside time for myself to practice in different ways that I needed to, without the guilt of, or the expectation of myself to spend every waking moment with the visiting guest. So
that reminds me of just setting yourself up for success and doing the mindfulness before difficult interactions, before difficult meetings, every day when your mother-in-law's in town. We often don't think about that. We think we're supposed to be present and caring for others, but your mindfulness practice probably made the situation infinitely better for everyone.
I like to think so. So in the midst of the interactions, the angst and the stress and the anxiety, like those are all opportunities to notice. And those are bits and pieces of information that comes up, and you can develop preferences. Like you're allowed to have your own opinions about what types of communications and topics that you prefer and don't prefer. Noticing what conversation topics actually triggers you is really, really great information. And then noticing your thoughts and feelings, allowing and accepting them just as they are. And then a lot of judgment was present. And we know that judgment, whether it be on ourselves or on other humans or others' judgment of us, can create stress, anxiety, anger, tension. normalizing all of that because we're human, but coming back into the fact that there is still a lot of love around for the kids, for my deceased father-in-law, for the relationships. And that common humanity of love can be so powerful in redirection and grounding amidst all of the noticing and the judgment. So that helped warm the judgment when it arose.
I think 90% of the impact is in the noticing. I think we are so focused in the fixing and the stopping. But sometimes if you just notice it, that's all you need to do to shift your inner energy. And to me, the noticing comes from the pause. And so in the pause, you notice, and then you decide how you want to move forward. And so you just mentioned this word noticing. And I think sometimes we think, oh, that's the not impactful part. Let me get to the fixing or the changing or the doing. And instead, notice, pause and notice. And you also mentioned accepting. And I always like to add accept and. Like, you don't have to like everything your mother-in-law does, but you can accept and be angry, or accept and allow, or accept and not like, or accept and be lovingly amused. That's one of my favorite ones for complicated family relationships.
And then the letting go. So letting go was key. And in terms of like easing the tensions, I think letting go was the action. It was the response that I was in control of. So letting go of my expectations for myself and also of everyone involved, especially also my kids. And then also letting go of the guilt of everything, of feeling even judgmental or angsty around my mother-in-law, and letting go of the guilt about needing to leave for a couple hours to do what it is that I needed to do to take care of myself, and sometimes even leaving with my kids to also bring in some spaciousness and some carefree time with their friends, in spending some time outside of the family unit during winter break.
Well, letting go was focusing on what was in your control. Your mother-in-law not being in your control, but choosing to let go of all those things.
And letting go of any control over her thoughts, feelings, and actions.
Out of your control.
Right. Reminding all of us that we cannot control the thoughts, feelings, and actions of anyone. And we would not want anyone to try to control our thoughts, feelings, and actions. So let us honor each other's agency as human beings for our own thoughts, feelings, and actions that we can take ownership of. And then the last thing that was somewhat difficult initially, but was so key to peace, was the communication and protecting of fierce boundaries. And so communicating those fierce boundaries, you have to do a lot of letting go of fears, of disappointment, of disapproval, of judgment when those boundaries are communicated. It is hard, especially dependent upon your own family circumstances and cultural upbringing about protecting boundaries and having boundaries. But I think it's key. This is where we can disrupt the habit of the shoulding and the habit of martyrdom, which we will be talking about. And it's key to you and your family's well-being, and your well-being is precious and should be prioritized, especially when you are taking care of others, and especially when those others have unique relationships with you.
I want to reflect on this idea of fierce boundaries. And what's coming to mind is our previous podcast with Kristen Neff about self-compassion. And she talks about tender self-compassion and fierce self-compassion. And what's interesting is you really connected with fierce self-compassion, and I really connected with tender self-compassion. And when I think about boundaries, for me, it's the exact same thing. I connect with tender boundaries, and you connect with fierce boundaries. And so it's knowing yourself. And I think fierce is really, I think what you're referring to, it is more around like self-protection and taking good care of you. And that for you to be able to do that, you need to generate this like energy about it and like a strong, resolute commitment to the boundary. Is that true?
Yeah, I definitely think so. And then that mother bear instinct definitely comes up because some fierce boundaries needed to come up for protection for my kids.
So what's so interesting is, for me, the most effective way for me to set a boundary is from a tender place of like compassion and from love. And so and there isn't a right way to do it. I'm that is not my point at all, but just to notice for each individual where their most impactful boundary setting comes from. And so for me, the tenderness around love and setting a boundary from a place of love, in that I couldn't love a mother-in-law or a mother or a someone else who was leading me to feel resentful or hurting someone I loved, for example. But that fierce energy for me, for whatever reason, I feel this like defensive, negative energy. It's so interesting because when you say that word, so that's why I wanted to reflect on just different personalities, knowing what works for you. Because for me to ask like, well, what would love do? Love would leave with my children. What would love do? And I don't know this situation again, but what would love do? It would take a break. What would love do? It would meditate. And so that question for me is actually a form of a boundary. It just comes in a different setting. And it's interesting because in some ways it is fierce just by, I almost think a boundary itself is by nature fierce, but I like to approach it with tenderness. And I just offer to listeners, like, choose what works for you. Some of you, fierce is going to be the thing, like you have to be fierce or you won't do it. And I love the mama bear tendency, and just knowing where your mama bear shows up best and where you take the best care of you, if that makes sense.
So noticing, letting go, and boundaries, whether they be tender or fierce. I hope sharing these tips helps with your unique relationships, because ultimately these were all acts of mindfulness and self-compassion in different forms.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's really the message, is that when we bring mindfulness and self-compassion and a lot of these coaching tools, that we are in control of these relationships. I think we don't have agency in the mother-in-law relationship. And that's really the sort of societal sharing and the entertainment sharing of mother-in-law relationships. Is there, it's we don't have agency. And so my invitation as we get towards the end is to show up for them with agency and show up for them with intention. And what that means to you is going to be different. And I just wanted to reflect that that means being intentional about what you do and what you say, and then what you think and feel about it, and then the tone in which you do all of that. And setting intentions around those. Like, I think we often focus on what I'm going to do and what I'm going to say. And to me, it's really all of the above. It's how you think and feel about what your mother-in-law does, what you do, and the tone of the relationship. And in the beginning, when we talked about the intention, that to me is the tone. Choose the tone of your relationship and then ground into that and focus on that. And the last bit that I wanted to bring up, just for mostly, I think, women physicians, but those of us who think we're right, and I fit in that category. But when you become a mother-in-law, and I have been very conscious about this, and I think most mother-in-laws think we're right. We think there's a right way and a wrong way. And we bring a lot of these old habits of catastrophizing. And, well, if I don't get in here and fix, manage, and control this, something terrible is going to happen. And so just remembering that your way isn't necessarily their way. It's the right way for you, but it's not necessarily the right way for them. And this has come up for me around my impending grandchild. And like my way of approaching pregnancy and deliveries and all of these things is not going to be my son and daughter-in-law's way. And when I go to my medical thing of I know better, I'm a pediatrician after all, so I'm an expert in this. That is not going to get me the relationship that I want. And so being mindful and being one of my words for the year, which I continue to share now, is deliberate. So being deliberate and being deliberately loving and deliberately flexible and deliberately kind and non-judgmental. So not only not judging myself, not judging them. And these are all mindfulness. So it's like showing up, as you like to say, hands wide open. And when I do parent coaching, and we've talked about this a few times, the goal is a long, healthy relationship. The goal is not a win in this moment or that moment. And so what will lead you to a long, healthy relationship? Sometimes it's setting boundaries. Sometimes it's sharing your wisdom. So this doesn't mean that I'm not going to share my pediatric mom wisdom of all these years and what makes a healthy whatever, but I'm not going to attach to whether, they respect me or not if they do it. And so it's literally what I do, what I say, and then what I think and feel about whatever they decide to do. And to be, this might be one of my other intentions, is to just be available. And I like this vision of hands wide open, because my long-term goal is to love my son, my grandson, my daughter-in-law, and to be in their lives for a long time. And I think when you look at that long-term vision, and with any mother-in-law, right, you want to get to the end and have a loving relationship.
So you're going to be deliberate about your pediatrician physician roles and how that shows up in your relationship with your daughter-in-law and your son and your soon-to-be grandchild. And you bringing up the hands wide open that is taught in mindfulness-based stress reduction, that could be a foundation for how we approach these unique relationships in general.
Perhaps all relationships,
right? Like,
you tend to be very graspy about relationships, just saying.
That we can loosen up on clinging to the expectations. We can loosen up on the pushing away when there is strife. Can we simply approach the relationship with hands wide open, resting upon perhaps a foundation of love?
That's the one thing I was going to add there is hands wide open without the love doesn't feel right. But hands wide open is an act of love. I think sometimes we think when we're not in there fixing and mucking around, that it's not loving and we're not making sure everything turns out right, but can actually be more loving to show up with hands wide open. So I love that, resting on a foundation of love. So eloquent.
So the image that comes up for me is the word love and then your hands atop of it.
Beautiful. Really beautiful.
As we close the podcast, we like to ask you, dear listener, some reflection questions.
Notice your reaction to the words mother-in-law and decide if you might like to practice a different reaction.
Where are the more unique and perhaps more challenging relationships of your life? And what are your thoughts about trying out noticing, letting go, and boundaries, tender or fierce, as ways to ease the navigation of these unique relationships?
What kind of mother-in-law or father-in-law do you want to be? And what kind of daughter-in-law, son-in-law, sister-in-law would you like to be? What is your intention? And what would peace do? And what would love do?
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please share widely and leave us reviews. We'd also love to delve into your unique relationships at our Connect in Nature retreat in person, July of 2023.
All the things that we teach at the Connect in Nature retreat will help you with challenging relationships. It's a chance to grow a mindfulness practice And as you heard from Ni Chang, practicing mindfulness while her mother-in-law was visiting was essential to a peaceful, harmonious experience. And so all of the different practices will give you a whole toolbox for which you can approach mothers, mother-in-laws, fathers, father-in-laws, and challenging unique, I like that, unique relationships of all kinds. And unique is such a beautiful word. And I'm going to add that the Connect in Nature retreat is 1,000% unique. I don't know another retreat that's like it in the variety of offerings and practicing them in nature, and the chance to work with both of us in our very different approaches and skills. And if you want to delve into your difficult relationships, whatever they might be, I highly recommend coaching. It has transformed all of my relationships. And I really encourage you to take the leap and try it, because when we get to the end of our lives, it's the healthy relationships that are the things that people value the most and wish that they had had more healthy relationships. And so whenever in your life you can attend to them and learn the tips and tricks and tools to shift them. Any coaching that I have done on any relationship has poured over goodness into all of my other relationships. And if intensive coaching feels like the right approach, you can do that at the Sagrada retreat. We do the whole 8 hours of group coaching there, where people really do tackle difficult relationships and often leave with a whole new perspective or a unique phrase. In fact, the whole Loving Amusement episode came from a client at the most recent Sagrada retreat, and it was about a challenging relationship with a sister. And so realizing that these intense experiences can also be incredibly transformative in shifting your perspective.
And most importantly, healing.
Yes, absolutely. Thus, the Mindful Healers podcast and the Mindful Healers retreat and the Mindful Healthcare Collective, where we focus on healing for those in healthcare. So we would love to have you join us for any of these things. We offer so many different opportunities because we know that everyone has a different entry point and a different crack that lets the light in, as Rumi says. So links for Connect in Nature, for the Mindful Healthcare Collective, for the different retreats, getting coached, and joining me for yoga to also start your Zen as you approach unique relationships will all be in the show notes.
Please stay on after the sound of the singing bowl for our mindful moment offering.
As always, if you want to declutter your mind, be more present, and start truly living your one wild and precious life, come find us at the mindfulhealerspodcast.com.
Work with one of us.
Work with both of us.
Start or uplevel your mindfulness practice.
Discover how mindful coaching can change your life.
Or even better, do both as part of our Mindful Healers programs and retreats. You can find links to find out more about our programs and join our communities at themindfulhealerspodcast.com.
Reach out and get started on your journey to a life better lived today.
The content of this podcast is not meant to be medical or life advice. If you choose to participate in our mindful moments, please do so safely.
Welcome to today's mindful moment. This is going to be a hand to heart practice. So if possible, set yourself up in a place where your hands are free. If you're driving, please opt out. And if you're not in a safe space to practice mindfulness, please come back later. Taking a moment to get comfortable wherever you are, sitting, standing, whatever. Bring one hand to your heart and the other hand atop. Notice the palm of your hand right on your chest, and place the other palm on the back side of your hand on top of it. And pause here for a moment. Press in gently, releasing oxytocin, letting it circulate and enjoying it. Take in a long, deep inhale. And a huge exhale. And notice your hands on your heart once again. This hand to heart practice is in honor of complicated relationships. Whatever complicated relationship you have, it may be with your own mom, it may be with your mother-in-law, it may be with a child or a spouse or a colleague. Knowing that relationships, by their very nature, are complicated. Hand to heart, because hand to heart is what you do when there's love and it's complicated. Taking in a long, deep inhale once again. And a huge exhale, let it out. And just taking a moment to think about the complications of relationships. And where you love and it's complicated. It's frustrating. Doesn't go the way you think it should. But remembering that the base of all important relationships is love. You can love and not like. You can love and be frustrated, but reconnect with the love. Hand to heart is a reminder to connect with love. Hand to heart, what would love do? Taking in an inhale for the complexity of love. And a long, smooth exhale. Realizing that humans are by their very nature complex and complicated. Allowing yourself to acknowledge that and let it be. Nothing to fix. Oftentimes, we don't even have to understand. We can just let it be. Taking in an inhale of letting it be, not fixing, not managing, not controlling, not understanding, just being. And an exhale of the urge to jump in and change things. An inhale of the desire to connect. An exhale, you connecting. Inhale the desire for love. Exhale an intention to love. Inhale flexibility. And exhale. Inhale hope. Exhale. And just notice how you feel. Hand to heart, once again, for the complexity of human relationships, for the complexity of love. Those you love very often don't act like you think they should. In fact, you don't often act like they think you should. A breath of acceptance. Breathing out resistance. And taking a moment to send yourself some more oxytocin. Press the heel of your hand in towards the heart space and enjoy those good feelings circulating around. In your mind's eye, envision the cortisol in your saliva melting away. And notice the tingles in your arms and your legs. Taking in another inhale of love and compassion for yourself. And exhaling love and compassion for everyone out there. Breathing in an acceptance of humanness. Breathing out any sense of perfection or that others should be different. Breathing in the idea that everyone really truly is doing the best that they can, even if it's not what we think they should do. Exhaling any resistance to that. Not a past that they can't do better, but in the moment, they are rarely intending to do harm. Pressing the heel of your hand into your heart space once again, letting those good feelings hope, love, compassion, kindness, flexibility, acceptance circulate around, drinking in the breath to help aid their journey through every nook and cranny of your body. And a long, smooth, huge exhale. And a moment to notice this deep sense of relaxation. Nothing to do, nothing to fix. Noticing the sense of connection you feel to yourself and to those you love, even those that are hard to love. May you have a week full of love and acceptance and kindness and compassion for yourself and for others. You can slowly lower your hands and open your eyes. Let the light in slowly. Have a beautiful week.